Today's talk is inspired by a program called Westworld. Our son Alex was quite keen on it, and he showed it to us from his streaming service a couple of months ago. And I don't really want to say very much about it other than this quote I found quite enthralling. So Dr. Robert Ford, one of the main characters in the program, and he says this: "I believed that stories helped us to ennoble ourselves, to fix what was broken in us, to help us become the people we dreamed of being, lies that told a deeper truth." And that last sentence really spoke to a question that had come up a few months ago. An atheist saying, well, why is the lie even necessary? Why not just lay out the truth? Wouldn't that be simpler? Wouldn't that be more straightforward? So I'm thinking today then about the idea of story as the vehicle for truth. And I want to begin here. I have a variety of books here. Can anybody tell me what these are? They are instructions. User manuals. They represent a very efficient way of presenting facts, presenting the truth. They're brief, they're comprehensive, so it's very concise way of presenting the truth. The thing that all of these have in common is they are probably the least read books in your household. Would you say? So if you buy a new piece of equipment, how many of you spend hours poring over the user manual before you plug it in and turn it on?
I do.
You do?
Because, for example.
Well, perhaps it says something about us. I'm not sure it necessarily says that, but it says something about us. So why is the Bible written in story? Why not just produce a user manual of life? Well, because we ignore the user manuals. And the other thing is, it's not just about communicating information. The Bible is about communicating information in a way that inspires change. And that's what we're going to think about today. So in a sense, if we look at the Bible, it's not an efficient means of laying out the facts, but it is an effective means of laying out the truth. If we understood the truth, just the plain truth presented to us, and we accepted it automatically, you think about how many problems in the world would be instantly solved if that were the case. If we were able to take on unadorned truth and just apply it to our lives. There are so many things in the world that would change instantly if we were able to accept unadorned truth. And I find it really interesting that an atheist comes to the Bible and says this should be a user manual, because it's not how we work. And all ancient cultures used story to teach. The Bible is no different. So why is it we are now as a culture, as a society, beginning to accept ancient cultures, and yet we reject this one? All right, I want to talk about story. I'm going to talk about a book that I've waved before, which is Made to Stick. It talks about 4 functions of stories. First of all, they hold our attention in the way that a user manual never will. Okay? Second of all, they present diverse perspectives. They present characters with different feelings. So we empathise with the characters in a story. We examine their motives for the actions and choices that they make. It prompts us to examine a particular issue from many different sides, not just our own narrow focus, but from many different angles. It allows us to experiment with different courses of action through a particular problem or issue. They help us understand how different people react to those problems. The third thing story does is lower our resistance. Stories are disarming. Now we have an example in the Bible of the prophet Nathan who goes to King David. King David has taken another man's wife, and to try and cover it up, he has had the man killed. And Nathan approaches the king, and how does he do it? He tells him a story. David makes judgment on the character in the story, and Nathan then says, "O king, that's you. You have done this," which brings about David's repentance. So it's disarming in a way that just coming up to someone and sort of nailing them and saying, "You've done this," just doesn't do. I find it really interesting that if we look at films, there are a couple of well-known actors who are vocally atheist, and yet they have acted in films that portray an afterlife. So the examples I think of are Ricky Gervais, English actor, well-known and outspoken atheist, who acted in a film in 2008 called Ghost Town. He plays the part of a dentist who sees dead people. And another one is Matt Damon, who acted in a movie called Hereafter in 2010, which is about a tsunami. And he also has contact with people who are dead. Now you could say, well, they're only in those films because they've been paid to be in those films. But then imagine if we went to Matt Damon and Ricky Gervais and said, "We'll pay you the same amount to be a spokesperson for our church." Would they do it? No, I don't think they would. So stories have this disarming quality about them. And then the last thing stories do is they inspire us to action. Made to Stick talks about them being a flight simulator for the brain. They put knowledge into a framework that is more lifelike. Let's throw a quick problem at you. An experiment done on college students in coping with stress. They had 3 groups of students and they asked them to think about a stressful situation. And here's what they did. So the first group were given instructions in problem solving and sent home. The second group were called the event simulation group. They were asked to mentally simulate how the problem had unfolded. So in their mind, they're told to think about the problem and how it occurred. The third group were called the outcome simulation group. They were asked to visualize a positive future outcome. Now, those last 2 groups were told to spend 5 minutes a day for a week doing those 2 activities. Either go over the problem in your mind or go over the visualization of the solution in your mind. Now, I want to ask you, which of those 3 groups fared the best after a week? The group that did the best was group 2. Telling the story of the problem, not imagining a positive outcome, telling the story of the problem, which really confronted me as a man because I'm outcome focused. I think about, can we come to a solution for this issue? But here's what he said about group 2. So the group 2 cohort immediately felt better about the situation that they were thinking about. They were more likely to have taken concrete action to solve their problem after a week. They were more likely to have sought advice and support from others, and they were more likely to report that they had learnt something and grown. It's interesting, isn't it? Telling the story, that's all. Telling the story. So, the authors of Made to Stick conclude this. They said, maybe financial gurus shouldn't be telling us to imagine that we're filthy rich. Instead, they should be telling us to replay the steps that led to our being poor. All right, I want to share with you something Swedenborg writes about the Bible in story. All Bible stories are the kind of truth that is relatively distant from real divine teachings. Still, they serve as a means for gradually introducing children and youths into deeper teachings about truth and goodness, and eventually to truly divine teachings, since divinity is at the core of the teachings. When the stories are read by children and touch their innocent hearts, the angels with them experience heavenly delight, being drawn by the Lord to the inner meaning, and therefore to the things that the narrative details represent and symbolise. The heavenly delight of the angels is what flows into the children and gives them pleasure. And then he continues. The whole point of putting stories in the Word was to bring about this first stage, the childish and youthful stage of people who are to be reborn. That is why the stories were written in such a way that absolutely everything in them would contain something divine. So we have from what Colin read to us this morning, all these things Jesus spoke to the multitude in parables. And without a parable he did not speak to them. So this word parable has two parts, the para at the beginning and the bol at the end. And it means to cast or throw beside. If you think about the word parallel, it's the same root as the beginning, parallel, beside, two lines beside, and bol, to throw. So when we have the word hyperbole, it means to throw over, to exaggerate what we're saying. So Jesus is casting beside when he tells these stories to relate a truth. And I want to just then finally think about the story that we heard Jesus speak, the parable of the wheat and the tares. So the seed that is planted, that is scattered in the field, is divine truth. That is what it is the Lord wishes to teach us. The tares that emerge, the weeds, they are the many other ideas in our mind. And this is our problem. This is why we don't just have a user manual for life, because we have many other issues which distract or detract from the truth. And they all grow together in our mind. They emerge while men slept, it is said. So sleep is a state of natural life, of unconsciousness. You think about the way that we approach life so often, and especially these days with our phones. You just watch people walking around with a headset on and buried in their phone, and they have no consciousness of what is going on around them. Actually, life 20 years ago was no different. We were still unconscious, it's just we didn't have a thing to hold on to create the unconsciousness. It was already there. The enemy is not an individual. it's not Satan or the devil, it's just any principle that stands opposed to the truth. Any principle that detracts or distracts us from what is really going on and what we need to learn. Anything which is opposed to spiritual life. And so these all sprout and they begin to produce a crop. And they need to grow to the harvest because they need to reach their fulfillment. We need to go through life processes, sometimes very difficult, in order to be able to distinguish what is true and real and what is false or merely apparent. So they grow together, and at the harvest, that's the point, at the end of temptation, we might say, that is the point where we are able to distinguish what is true from what is false. And that's the point where we actually learn the reality. So the parable in itself speaks to the condition of our mind, and it speaks to why we don't get unadorned truth presented to us. Because it's not just about memorizing a list of facts, it's about actually applying it to our life and actually seeing the outcome of what is true compared to the outcome of what is false. And that's why the Bible is written in story. So, look, as we approach the week ahead, I'll just suggest a couple of things. One is to notice how we walk through life unconsciously, how we walk through life asleep. You may see others do it, but notice how you yourself approach an issue unconsciously with a bias of some kind or assuming an outcome when actually the outcome is something different. That's one example. And then look at story. The stories in the Word, but other stories as we find them presented elsewhere, and see if you can discern the value and the principles that are being taught by those stories.